Welcome to the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast.
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 Welcome to the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast with me, Dr. Janine Anderson. Heads up, this show may contain adult language and may mention specific foods. If you find either of those to be too triggering, I trust you to take care of yourself and do what you need to do. This podcast is sponsored by ED Care. ED Care has provided PHP, IOP, and outpatient treatment for all genders 18 and over since 2001. CAMSA, which stands for Connection, Acceptance, Mindfulness, Sense of Self, and Action, is ED Care's mindfulness-based treatment approach and is incorporated into each individualized treatment plan. Facilities are located in Denver, Colorado Springs, and Kansas City, and all treatment is supported by master's level clinicians or higher. ED Care offers 4 specialty tracks for binge eating disorder, elite athletes, substance use, and trauma. And the Connections House, an affordable supportive housing component, adds an extra layer of supervised support. Visit eatingdisorder.care or call 866-771-0861.
Hi, my friends. I just wanted to jump on here and go through a few things that I think are signs of recovery that we don't talk a lot about. I know it can be so difficult when you are recovering and trying to do all this hard work day in and day out and every single meal and snack, and it's so exhausting. And I really believe and get excited to talk about this with my own patients, to reflect on the things that are signs of progress, because we need to acknowledge when we're getting better as you're going along. It's very motivating. I think it's absolutely deserving of our time to celebrate and revel in progress people are making. And I thought I would make this episode of just 5 quick ones that I could think of off the top of my head. Signs that you're recovering that have nothing to do with weight. And the reason why I think that's important is, of course, sometimes people's weights are being monitored in their recovery, and I know that that can feel really complicated and tricky and upsetting, and I would never convey that if you're needing to weight restore, that means you're not needing to weight restore, that anybody's eating disorder troubles are more or less legitimate than anybody else's. Just different types of paths that people have when they have an eating disorder and when they're trying to recover. But I know that a lot of it, especially if you're in treatment, like at a higher level of care, can be centered around the idea of weight, whether that's because you have fat-phobic treatment providers who are commenting on it, or there are weight restoration goals for you, or for you yourself, or family members, or loved ones, or people in your circle who are commenting on your weight. So I wanted to get on here and talk about this because I think the ideas of weight and recovery, or weight and wellness, are really all tangled up in our common perceptions, and we need to separate those out. And so I wanted to talk about 5 things that I think are signs that you're making progress in your recovery that have nothing to do with weight. The first one I would say is improved sleep. And I know this may sound a little bit like womp womp. Sleep is, to me as a psychologist, sleep is something that is not glamorous. It's not a sexy answer to things. Like we talk about, oh, how can we help people have better mental health? It's like, well, if everybody were sleeping a lot better, it improves a ton. Sleep is so, so, so important and so healing to us. So I know maybe it sounds a little bit anticlimactic, but truly, if your sleep is getting better, that's a really good sign. One of the things that can happen when you have an eating disorder is that regardless of what your symptoms are and all of this, is that it can really affect your sleep, particularly if you're experiencing malnourishment. So you're not eating enough or eating enough of the types of things that your body is needing to nourish itself. One of the things that can happen because of that is that you'll have difficulty falling and staying asleep, and your sleep will not be as restorative. So this is one of those signs to pay attention to as you're working really hard in recovery. Is your sleep getting better? When you wake up in the morning, are you feeling like your sleep is more restorative? Do you feel like you're falling asleep a little bit easier? You feel like you're staying asleep through the night? The other piece that's really notable and worth acknowledging and getting excited about with sleep is that biologically, sleep is very important and there are benefits to sleeping better and having better quality sleep. But what it can also be a reflection of is that maybe something else for you is improving as well. For example, perhaps you are experiencing a reduction in your symptoms of anxiety. So even if we make the argument that somehow that's not directly related to your eating disorder, it will not only feel better to feel less anxious, but having less anxiety and having better sleep can only do good things for your eating disorder recovery. So this is one of the first things I'll point out with people is, hey, how's your sleep feeling? Is that getting any better? Are sleep disturbances, as we would say as psychologists, are those going away? So that is the first one, is your sleep is improving. Again, this has nothing to do with anybody's weight. People at all weights, in all shapes and sizes, who have all kinds of different identities and life stories have all kinds of different relationships with sleep. I'm actually considering doing a whole episode about sleep and the relationship between sleep recovery and metabolism. If you all are interested in that, go ahead and let me know. That would be great. Okay, my second sign, and again, these are just five. These are just five that we're getting started with. The second sign that you're making progress in recovery that has nothing to do with weight is that you're feeling more present in your life. So by this I mean that you're not as distractible. You're not struggling with inattention. You are not just thinking eating disorder thoughts 80, 90, 100% of the time. So when you are going through that, it's so difficult, and having the eating disorder is incredibly time consuming and consuming of your mental energy and your heart, of course. And it's so important to notice when that starts to decrease. Maybe it's very subtle when you pick up on it at first. You notice, oh yeah, I was paying attention during that whole super boring meeting at work. I was present during that, or I felt really present when I was hanging out with my partner, or I felt really present when I was working on this thing, or during some sort of a religious service. And you notice you were completely in that one moment. You were just there doing work, connecting with your spirituality, connecting with another person, and you weren't distracted and you didn't have these eating disorder thoughts in the background. And I would say with the people I've worked with, this is generally what people notice, is that there's not a hard and fast point where you just stop having eating disorder thoughts, but what people will report, and this is true for me in my recovery, is that you just notice a gradual increase in the times when it's just you and the eating disorder is not there present in the picture, interfering and interrupting all of your thoughts and being really intrusive. So that is sign number 2, is you feel more present in your life. You're having fewer eating disorder thoughts. Of course, if you're doing fewer eating disorder behaviors, that will increase that. But this is a big deal and you shouldn't overlook it. So even if you're having what you'd consider small improvements, like you notice you're thinking eating disorder thoughts for 1 hour less per day, that's awesome. Give yourself a good high five for that. My third sign that you are making progress in recovery that has nothing to do with weight is that you're saying no more frequently. I have never worked with a client who had an eating disorder who we didn't have to talk a lot about boundaries with. Given the kind of archetypal, stereotypical structure, personality traits that people have who tend to have eating disorders, that perfectionistic, really overachieving, very conscientious, driven, very people-pleasing, it is so hard to say no. And sometimes when we say no, people have a bad reaction. It would be great if we could say no and then our saying no is instantly reinforced with a really great response from people. But that is definitely not always the case. The reason why it's important to acknowledge this as a non-weight related sign of recovery is that boundaries are absolutely essential for recovery, and I would say for feeling well throughout the rest of your life. Acknowledging your limitations can be a really difficult step for people, especially if you struggle with some issues of underlying shame, perfectionism, or desires to perform in certain ways, especially in front of other people. It can be really hard to say no, but saying no is really, really important. Several ways that plays out. First, if you can't say no and you say yes to everything in your relationships, you are going to be exhausted and resentful because people are going to ask a lot of you. Sometimes they may not even know how overextended you are. And if you're exhausted, that always interferes with recovery, kind of similar to our first sign of non-weight signs of recovery of getting good sleep. It also is going to make you really irritable in your relationships. Like, gosh, why are people asking me to do things for them all the time? Why do I have to take care of this? I wish they wouldn't always come to me. And we want to make sure that you're not inadvertently reinforcing that tendency for other people. You know, there are some people in our lives, I'm sure you all can relate, who are just ask a lot of us, and sometimes people are demanding, and it's really good to say no. Another important boundary of saying no is with divesting from diet culture, getting away from diet culture, and changing the way that you relate with other people so that not all of your relationships are revolving around connecting over hating your bodies, whatever diet people are on, and discussing those sort of things. So setting boundaries and saying no can actually be directly related to eating disorder recovery, in that you say, I don't want to hang out with this person all the time if all they're going to do is talk about their keto diet or what have you. Or you say, you know, I would love to hang out with that person, and then you tell them, I'd love to hang out with you. I just can't do that if we're going to talk about this food stuff again the whole time. It's not good for me. Saying no, lastly, is also a sign of respect for yourself. I think the phrase, and I can't think of how else to say this, but the phrase acknowledging your own limitations can have this negative connotation for people, in that we're basically saying, I can't do this or I can't do that, or, you know, you've reached your limit. But actually, that's a neutral thing. That's not a negative thing. No one can do everything. Nobody does it all, and nobody does it all well. We certainly don't do things well all the time. So by saying no, it's actually being really respectful of what you can and cannot do. A lot of the times when people are struggling with boundaries, I'll ask them to think about, how would you approach this if this were anybody except you? Like, how would you approach this if this were another person? Would you ask anybody else in your life to say yes to every request, every social obligation, every obligation at work? And most people would say, probably not. That really doesn't sound so good to me. For you, it's the same thing. It's good for you to say no when you can't do something or when something is not good for your recovery. So again, saying no is a huge, huge sign of recovery. And a lot of the times people who start their recovery, you know, come in at a point where they can't say no at all, or it's extremely difficult, or it's terrifying for them. So saying no in any form, and definitely saying no when it's appropriate in increasing frequency, is a huge sign that you're valuing taking care of yourself and your emotional energy, and that you need that for recovery. Because again, if you think all the way back to the eating disorder vicious cycle that has, you know, that episode is much older now. Whenever we're in a state of upset, that is opportune time for the eating disorder to pop up in there and say, hey, I'd like to help you out with this difficult time. Let's do some behaviors and we'll have a party together for the foreseeable future. So anytime you're saying no, you're going against that tendency because you're making sure that you are taking care of your emotional energy. And when we tend to our feelings and our emotional needs, it makes it a whole lot easier to continue on that road of recovery. A fourth sign that has nothing to do with weight that you are making progress in recovery. You're having more fun. I like to say that eating disorders get their hooks in every aspect of our lives, and that's the bummer news. They affect a lot. They affect physical health, they affect mental health, they affect spirituality, they affect relationships. A lot of the time they affect work, they affect our relationship with movement. They get into everything. The flip side of that is that when you're making progress in recovery and when you recover, everything in your life gets better. All of the domains of your life get better. And one of the I was about to say one of the most fun ones is having more fun, which is absolutely true. When people are struggling with their eating disorder, it is beyond difficult to find joy in things because eating disorders are rough. They're these soul-sucking, emotion-sucking, energy-sucking things that are often for people are full of extremely, extremely negative self-talk echoed by diet culture, and it is hard to be lighthearted and to have fun. Even more so, sometimes people have the idea that restriction is more noble, which it's not. That's a disordered thought, but it's also a thought that is completely validated by our disordered culture, and that somehow it's more virtuous to be, I'm using air quotes here, disciplined, or to restrict or to diet, and that somehow having fun is less virtuous. There's no benefit to it. We should all be working hard and dieting hard and all of these things, which is obviously just ridiculous. But one of the major signs that you're making progress in recovery is that you are having more fun. This shows that you are taking care of the whole spectrum of your emotional needs, the whole spectrum of what you need in your life. And of course, there are times where we might need to be more disciplined about some area of our lives, but there are a lot of times when we really need to have fun and enjoy and to have free time and to do things without expectation or obligation. And it's really common for people, especially when they are dealing with any kind of restriction behaviorally or mentally, like they think they shouldn't be eating something, to also restrict other areas of their lives like fun or pleasure. Like they won't go out and have fun, they won't put any free time on their schedules, they won't indulge in any pleasurable foods, they restrict sex and sexual pleasure. So when you're having more fun in your life, it is absolutely a sign that you're making progress in recovery. Again, a sign that has nothing to do with your weight. It also shows that if you're having fun, it's hard to have the eating disorder be there in that same moment. So if you're having more moments of fun, by default, you're having fewer eating disorder moments, which is incredible. And it's one of the things that I think is so important to acknowledge as a sign that you're making progress in your recovery, because you need to notice those things along the way instead of letting them pass you by and not really appreciating them. But if you think to maybe the toughest time when you've had your eating disorder, how much fun were you having at that point? How fun was it truly? Like, even if publicly you're presenting like you're having a bunch of fun, what was it like when you were alone with yourself? So I think being able to experience fun and joy and being carefree is absolutely a sign that the eating disorder is taking up a lot less space in your life and in your heart. My fifth and final sign for this episode, again, these are just 5 to start, so send me more for sure. I'd be very curious to hear yours. The fifth and final sign that you are making progress in recovery that has nothing to do with weight is that your relationships are improving. Eating disorders are so connected to our relationships. And of course, I would never say other people cause our eating disorders, although for sure there are some people who have people in their lives who have contributed a lot or given them some really unhelpful messaging. But our relationships are so connected to the eating disorder because when you have an eating disorder, it's so disconnecting. There's no way that you can be completely connected to other people in the most authentic form that you could otherwise. Eating disorders force people to lie. They force people to be sneaky. A lot of the times when people have an eating disorder, other people in their lives have no idea. And it's a huge, oftentimes shameful secret that nobody else knows about and can support them on. So even by virtue of engaging in relationships, potentially when appropriate, like sharing that you're struggling with that, it's an improvement in your relationship. Setting boundaries with other people is an improvement in your relationship. asking for people to do things for you in your relationships is a huge sign of recovery because that is assertiveness. It can be really easy to fall into a way of being in our relationships where we try to make ourselves needless, to pretend like we don't have needs. Oh, I'm chill. I don't need that. Whatever you want, whatever's easiest for you. And it can be pleasant to be that way sometimes, but overall in your relationships, if you are not getting your needs met and you never ask anything of the other person, your relationship will never be as deep as it could be if you were being more authentic about what you're asking for. Being able to navigate relationships in a way that feels more congruent and values driven to you is so helpful. It will bring depth and richness to your connection with those other people. And when you're really in the throes of an eating disorder, a lot of the time, so much of that is happening in isolation, in secrecy. The eating disorder can bring up thoughts like explicitly trying to talk you out of having relationships. And very, very importantly, relationships can be a huge way that people feel supported. If you feel adequately supported, if you feel really wonderfully supported, your eating disorder is going to have a whole lot less to do for you. So if you are noticing that you're trying to start more relationships, if you're seeking them out more, if you're starting to deepen your current relationships by opening up more, spending more time with somebody, isolating a little bit less, or if you are taking your relationships to potentially an even more difficult level where you are working through some things that aren't going so well in a current relationship, this is all a sign of recovery. Prioritizing your relationships and working on them is an amazing, amazing thing to do. It can be really hard, and that's why it's important to stop and take notice when you're doing it, because it will serve you so well. The more you get your needs met from yourself, from your relationships, the less your eating disorder is going to have opportunity to say, I'd like to help you through this or that difficult feeling, because sometimes people in our lives can take that role. It's also so important to say no and to be able to confront people when things aren't going well in relationships so that we can work through conflict and deepen those relationships and maintain those connections. Even maintaining a relationship is a huge sign of recovery because it's so easy to get lost in that shame and isolation and just withdrawing and being by yourself instead. It takes courage to stay in the game and to keep working on those relationships when you're struggling with an eating disorder that can take so much energy out of your life. So in wrapping up, I'm going to go through those 5 signs of recovery that have nothing to do with weight. Number 1, your sleep has improved. Number 2, you're feeling more present in your life, less distracted by your eating disorder. Number 3, you're saying no and setting boundaries. Number 4, you're having more fun. And number 5, your relationships are improving. So with that, I'll leave you and I'll talk to you in the next episode.
Thanks for joining me for another episode. Let's keep in touch. You can find all the information you need about the podcast at eatingdisorderrecoverypodcast.com, including full podcast episodes and links to all of our social media sites. You can join our Facebook group for the podcast by searching Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast on Facebook. This is a closed group for listeners of the podcast looking to connect, share resources, and get involved in a pro-recovery community. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or YouTube. Please leave us a review and let us know how we're doing. Talk to you next time on the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast.